And now we address economic concerns, perhaps the most important topic for most people. You'll notice that we began with energy, the force that drives most of the world's economy today. Then we followed with the environment, the source of all energy and material resources that the economy needs in order to function. And now we want to explore how the economy works, particularly in relation to money and debt. For some reason, most modern-day economists tend to downplay the fact that economic activity is founded on primary wealth, or nature's bounty. It's this primary wealth that we use to produce secondary wealth, such as food, infrastructure, buildings, and everything we need. But modern civilization has also created tertiary wealth, an abstract concept that increasingly exists on paper or in digital format, as represented by savings accounts, bonds, and stocks. Most retirees have savings and investments tied up in tertiary wealth, assuming it will be available if and when needed. Let's hope it is. We all know what money is, right? It's anything that's agreed upon and ratified by a given society as a medium of exchange or a store of value. And because all money is simultaneously someone else's liability, debt is the other side of every money unit. There are two key concepts to remember. First, all money is loaned into existence, which I'll explain later. And second, perpetual growth is the requirement of modern banking, whether we like it or not. Money may also be viewed as a claim on energy, the effort used in creating goods and services. It's created at no cost, but it's used to capture real energy. The key point is that all fiat money is symbolic and has value only because of government regulation or law. In the U.S., creating money is the responsibility of the Fed or Federal Reserve System, which is headed by a presidentially appointed board of governors. Most of us know this sobering fact, but it won't hurt to be reminded that banks are required to retain on hand only 10% of outstanding loans. As this illustration shows, an individual deposit of $1,000 can legally be loaned out for a total of $10,000 in outstanding loans, thus accounting for the 10% or $1,000 retained by the bank. So, what happens if persons with money deposited in a bank want to withdraw all of their funds on a single day? Oops, sorry, we can't do that. The bank is closed until further notice. So what about debt, the other side of every money unit? Simply put, financial debt is a contractual obligation to repay a given amount of money at some future time. There are two types of debt. A good debt is a secured instrument that can be used to borrow money for worthwhile purposes, buying a home, building a business, or gaining an education, with the likelihood of liquidating the debt within a reasonable time frame using earnings made possible by the investment loan. A bad debt is an unsecured loan for unnecessary but desired items, anything that isn't essential for living, like frivolous luxury items. One way to think of debt is to consider the human labor, services, time, and so on, that it will take at some future point to pay off the debt. With the exception of the Depression era in the 1930s, see the blue arrow, U.S. debt, the yellow line, remained below 200%, the green loop, of gross domestic product until 1985, when it began spiraling upward rapidly, the red loop, to 342% of GDP in 2008. Debt declined during the war years and lasted until reaching a bottom in the early 1950s. But beginning around 1955, it slowly crept upward until 1985, when it started a sharp upward trajectory. Of course, the debt is much higher now, and still rising, in response to the exponential factor. In this chart, we see the relationship of currency, or cash, to M1, M2, and M3, dating from 1960 until 2006, when M3 was dropped. M1 is the total of all the physical currency part of bank reserves, plus the amount in demand accounts, that is, checking or current accounts. M2 includes M1, plus most savings accounts, money market accounts, retail money market mutual funds, and small denomination time deposits, like certificates of deposit under $100,000. This chart goes to 2007 and shows how the two previous charts are related, both with hockey stick curves that match one another. U.S. debt at the beginning of 2012 is headed for $16 trillion, and the total U.S. debt is approaching $60 trillion. For an updated instant accounting, check out the website usdebtclock.org. Why do we see the same exponential trend since 1980? Because all money, as a commodity with a supply and demand factor, is backed by debt, so growth in money and debt typically go right along in lockstep. It took all of U.S. history, up to 1970, for the money supply to reach $500 billion, and only 35 more years to add $9.5 trillion, an increase of 20 times. In sum, U.S. debt, GDP, and the U.S. money supply are speeding up, and this growing debt assumes a larger future economic growth than the past, which we have good reasons to believe will not happen. Here we can see the total U.S. credit market debt has doubled 5 times since 1970, with growth, the red line, leveling off in 2008, and debt increasing. This alarming trend is causing people to reassess the economic scene. In order for the future to resemble the past, we need credit to double again this decade. But given the economic slowdown, this seems highly unlikely. Conclusion? As time has passed, we've been getting progressively less GDP growth for every unit of debt. The shaded areas in the monetary base chart, 1980 to 2011, represent U.S. recessions, showing a hockey stick upswing in 2007-2008, which also corresponds to the upswing in the national debt chart, 1940 to 2010. Credit growth in the private sector is off track, so the government and Fed are taking steps to keep the system on track. This 2008 chart shows that on a global level, several European countries were having serious monetary problems, similar to the U.S. Of course, the situation has worsened since then, with collapse narrowly avoided in Greece, for the time being at least. Obviously, we're dealing with huge numbers when we discuss global debt and liabilities, GDP, or any area of the financial system. Just how much is $1 billion or $1 trillion? Now, we're talking big money, but just how much can be demonstrated with the next chart. Composed of $100 bills, the billion-dollar collection you see at the top fills the tiny left-hand corner of the bottom photo, in green, of the huge trillion-dollar collection, which you'll notice includes 2 stacks instead of 1. Notice the tiny 6-foot-tall man in the lower left corner, hardly visible. The 8 stacks in the billion-dollar collection make up a tiny portion of the trillion-dollar collection. Now, imagine 13 more of these trillion-dollar stacks layered on top to form a stack 84 feet high, the equivalent of a 7-story building, or the equivalent of at least 4 large city square blocks of land space. Big money indeed. Can we completely trust all the economic data published by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, an arm of the U.S. Department of Labor? Much of what's happening economically seems to make more sense when we consider that the economy might not be growing, that the inflation rate might be higher than stated. Estimating U.S. GDP involves 3 areas: imputations, inferring that the price of an item tends to approach the cost of producing it; hedonics, inferring that ongoing improvements made to any item tends to raise its value, as occurs in electronics; and last, cash transactions based on all reported sales. Because imputations are not always reliable, and hedonics can produce false assumptions, we usually observe some fuzzy numbers being reported, backed by lower inflation figures and increased GDP figures. The upshot is that real GDP reporting is a double whammy. In 2010, we owed more than we earned, with median U.S. household income pegged at around $50,200 in comparison with federal unfunded obligation growth estimated at $54,600 per household. And what will the current year's figures be? Is this the type of legacy we want to leave our children, grandkids, and future world citizens? A mountain of debt? Let's hope not.